Our reading today is found in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 22 through 29. This is the word of Yahweh. Set apart a tithe of all the yield of your seed that is brought in yearly from the field. In the presence of Yahweh your Elohim, in the place that he will choose as a dwelling for his name, you shall eat the tithe of your grain, your wine, and your oil, as well as the firstlings of your herd and flock, so that you may learn to fear Yahweh your Elohim always. But if, when Yahweh your Elohim has blessed you, the distance is so great that you are unable to transport it, because the place where Yahweh your Elohim will choose to set his name is too far away from you, then you may turn it into money. With the money secure in hand, go to the place that Yahweh your Elohim will choose. Spend the money for whatever you wish, oxen, sheep, wine, strong drink, or whatever you desire. And you shall eat there in the presence of Yahweh your Elohim, you and your household rejoicing together. As for the Levites resident in your towns, do not neglect them, because they have no allotment or inheritance with you. Every third year you shall bring out the full tithe of your produce for that year, and store it within your towns. The Levites, because they have no allotment or inheritance with you, as well as the resident aliens, the orphans, and the widows in your towns, may come and eat their fill, so that Yahweh your Elohim may bless you in all the work that you undertake. What is tithing? Well, the answer to that question is both simple and complicated. Put simply, tithing is the setting apart of 10% of crop or animal yields in a season. The question of tithing becomes complicated when we begin to ask how the tithe was meant to operate in Israel, how tithing might apply to Christians today, and why God required Israel to tithe in the first place. In my experience, few biblical teachings have been more poorly understood or more grossly exploited than God's requirement that Israel set aside a tithe. We should begin by recognizing that the Covenant of Sinai established Israel as an agricultural economy and culture. Consequently, the tithe related specifically to this setting. The tithe of one's yield applied only to landowners and or to those who owned livestock, and it referred specifically to crop yields and to livestock production. Put more simply, not everyone who lived in the nation of Israel was required to tithe. The tithe was reserved for those who owned land or livestock. With the exception of the Levites, who were to tithe the portion of the tithe reserved for them, no other person in Israel was required to tithe under the Covenant of Sinai. To make what we've been exploring more specific, the tithe was relegated to crops and to livestock, and not to money or other forms of what we might call income. In other words, common laborers were certainly paid in some way for their labor in Israel, and even household servants were compensated with lodging, food, and clothing by their masters. But still, the tithe did not apply to such laborers. The tithe, again, was only of crop yields and livestock production. Only landowners and livestock owners tithed in Israel. The next question, then, is what was to be done with the first 10% of crop yields or livestock production set aside as a tithe? That question continues to be debated by scholars. In truth, apart from the explanations given in the Covenant of Sinai, history has not recorded precisely how the ancient Israelites attempted to enact the tithing requirements of God. Based on the verses we just read in Deuteronomy, Dr. Joseph Colson, who was my graduate school Old Testament professor, suggested in a lecture that the Covenant of Sinai actually required the setting aside of 30% of crop yields and livestock production, 10% for the festive tithe, 10% for the Levites, and 10% for the widow, the orphan, and the resident alien. And though I have not encountered that opinion apart from Dr. Colson, he did cite at that time a number of sources, so I presume adherents to this perspective do persist. Dr. Peter Craigie, however, in his commentary on Deuteronomy in the New International Commentary on the Old Testament series, summarizes what I have found most often in my study with respect to this question. He writes the following: the emphasis given to the tithe in these verses, in contrast to the more precise legislation contained in Numbers chapter 18 verses 21 through 32 and Leviticus chapter 27 verses 30 through 33, rests principally on the joyful meal of fellowship eaten by the whole family in the presence of God and the provision made for the Levites. Verses 28 through 29, the tithe of the third year. The time specified in verse 28 would seem to be year 3 and year 6 of the 7-year sabbatical cycle. On every third year in the cycle, the tithe was not taken to the sanctuary, but was to be set aside especially for certain less privileged classes of people. That's the end of the quotation. So, contained in Dr. Craigie's explanation is the perspective I have encountered most commonly in my research. Namely, such scholars suggest that the tithe described in Deuteronomy does not exhaust all of the tithing requirements of Israel, but instead these stipulations relate specifically to two aspects of the tithe, that is, the yearly feast and the care for the poor and Levites. These perspectives assume that additional tithing requirements might be found in the relevant passages in Numbers and in Leviticus mentioned by Dr. Craigie. However, to my reading, the Deuteronomy passage we are discussing describes the broader laws governing the tithe completely, with the other passages clarifying but not adding to those requirements. The passage from Numbers chapter 18, verses 21 through 26, for instance, reads as follows: To the Levites I have given every tithe in Israel for a possession in return for the service that they perform, the service in the tent of meeting. From now on, the Israelites shall no longer approach the tent of meeting, or else they will incur guilt and die. But the Levites shall perform the service of the tent of meeting, and they shall bear responsibility for their own offenses. It shall be a perpetual statute throughout your generations. But among the Israelites they shall have no allotment, because I have given to the Levites as their portion the tithe of the Israelites, which they set apart as an offering to the Lord. Therefore I have said of them that they shall have no allotment among the Israelites. Then Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, You shall speak to the Levites, saying, When you receive from the Israelites the tithe that I have given you from them for your portion, you shall set apart an offering from it to the Lord, a tithe of the tithe. The comment in verse 21, which says, To the Levites I have given every tithe in Israel for a possession in return for the service that they perform, quite understandably has led many interpreters to presume that Numbers 18 has gone beyond Deuteronomy 14, insofar as Deuteronomy 14 associates only the tithe in years 3 and 6 with the Levites, whereas Numbers 18 seems to say that all the tithes belong to the Levites. But I believe these verses are easily harmonized. Since the annual tithe was to be brought to the temple, animals sacrificed, first fruits offered, and so on, the covenant of Sinai delineated quite specifically which parts of every sacrifice and offering belonged to the priests, and the priests are a portion of the Levites. So in this way, a portion of all offerings made in the temple was reserved for the priests. What Numbers 18 has revealed is that these same requirements applied to the tithes brought to the temple annually. That is, the priests continued to receive their allotted portions of these offerings as well. Even more, as Deuteronomy has already told us, since every third year the entirety of the tithe was to be set aside for the Levites, the poor, and the alien, the Levites were required themselves to tithe this tithe when they received it. The additional passage in the Torah, which speaks of tithing, is Leviticus chapter 27, verses 30 to 33. It reads as follows: All tithes from the land, whether the seed from the ground or the fruit from the tree, are Yahweh's. They are holy to Yahweh. If persons wish to redeem any of their tithes, they must add 1/5 to them. All tithes of herd and flock, every 10th one that passes under the shepherd's staff, shall be holy to Yahweh. Let no one inquire whether it is good or bad, or make substitution for it. If one makes substitution for it, then both it and the substitute shall be holy and cannot be redeemed. Again, this passage doesn't affect what has been said in Deuteronomy. It simply answers a question as to whether a crop or animal technically part of the tithe, that is, part of the first 10% of crop yield or animal production, could be substituted by another portion of the crop or another animal. The concern in Leviticus seems to be around animal or crop fitness. What if an animal technically part of the tithe was sickly or particularly robust? Or if the first yield of crops were unhealthy, or more healthy than the rest? God required them to reserve these irrespective of their health or fitness. If they wished to make a substitute, they would have to add 1/5 to the amount of the substituted item. And once this had been done, Leviticus continued, it cannot be done again. So to return to the question with which we began, what is tithing and how did it work? Tithing in Israel was the setting aside of the first 10% of all crop yields in a harvest or of all livestock production in a breeding season. How did tithing work? In the Covenant of Sinai, God established a 7-year tithing cycle, broken down into 2 smaller 3-year cycles, followed by a 7th-year Sabbath. The 3-year cycles required the setting aside of the tithe in a storehouse in their local area. For the first 2 years, they were to take the tithe to the tabernacle or temple, presumably during the pilgrimage festivals that corresponded with the seasons of harvest, and they and their households were to eat the entire tithe during the festival. That is, the tithe was to be their food during their time of pilgrimage. In the case that the tithe in a given season was too large, or that the tabernacle or temple was too distant, they could sell the tithe locally and repurchase the items in the local area surrounding the tabernacle or temple. However, in the 3rd year, they were not to bring the tithe with them to the tabernacle or to the temple. Instead, in the 3rd year, they were to give the tithe to the Levites who lived in their towns, the resident aliens who lived with them, the orphans and the widows who lived in their midst. After 2 runs of this cycle, that is, after 6 years, they were to observe a Sabbath year in the 7th year, and we'll explore those requirements in our next discussion. As I said at the onset, it's unclear how precisely Israel enacted these laws, or if they tried to enact them at all. With respect to the 3-year cycle, it is possible that the tribes were on staggered schedules, or that even localities within tribes were on staggered schedules to make sure that the Levites and the poor were always being cared for in any given year. However, in terms of the 7th sabbatical year and the year of Jubilee every 50th year, which we'll explore in future discussions, it seems that the Covenant of Sinai required all of Israel to be on the same schedule. It's probably important to note that the tithe was quite separate from tributes Israel would later be required to pay to their kings, or to taxes. It's different than that. It's a separate requirement. Now we turn to our final 2 inquiries, which are intimately related to each other. Why did God require Israel to tithe? And how might the tithe apply to Christians today? Let's begin with why God required Israel to tithe. God told Israel through Moses that they were to observe the tithing requirements, and I quote, so that you may learn to fear Yahweh your Elohim always. God required ancient Israel to tithe as an act of faith. In order to observe all of the Sabbath requirements of Sinai, and tithing is part of those Sabbath requirements, whether the weekly Sabbath, the Sabbath every 7th year, or the Sabbath every 50th year, in order to observe any of those would require the Israelites to live by faith in a way considered foolish by all other nations and people on earth. For instance, not milking livestock 1 day every week is considered foolish by dairy farmers even today. And yet the Israelites were commended to rest their animals that day and trust God to care for them that 1 day. This required faith. As we'll see in our next discussion, not planting or harvesting crops every 7th year seems to run against all common sense and received wisdom, and yet every 7th year Israel had to trust God to provide for them. The 50th year Sabbath, the year of Jubilee, was even more extensive and required more faith. Tithing, as I said, was part of this Sabbath cycle, and it in part required the Israelites to live on only 90% of what their fields and livestock produced in a harvest or breeding season. Now, of course, even the wise today might recommend this, encouraging us to save the remaining 10% for possible future needs or even for retirement. But again, this was not what the tithe was for in Israel. God required the Israelites to eat the entire tithe during the annual pilgrimage festivals of the year it was produced for 4 out of every 6 years, and in the other 2 years to give the tithe to the Levites and to the disenfranchised. So the 10% reserved for the tithe was not a savings plan, nor was it an investment. Whatever they did with the remaining 90% of their yields, which was up to them, the tithe was to be eaten or given away in the year it was produced. During highly productive years, this might have been easy to do. However, I imagine during lean years or years of famine, obedience to these laws would have tested Israel's faith. In fact, there is ample evidence in the First Testament that Israel struggled to obey these laws consistently. For instance, God said the following to Israel through the prophet Malachi, preserved for us in Malachi chapter 3, verses 8 through 12. Will anyone rob God? Yet you are robbing me. But you say, how are we robbing you? In your tithes and offerings. You are cursed with a curse, for you are robbing me, the whole nation of you. Bring the full tithe into the storehouse, so that there may be food in my house, and thus put me to the test, says Yahweh of hosts. See if I will not open the windows of heaven for you and pour down for you an overflowing blessing. I will rebuke the locust for you, so that it will not destroy the produce of your soil, and your vine in the field shall not be barren, says Yahweh of hosts. Then all nations will count you happy, for you will be a land of delight, says Yahweh of hosts. So then, having come to understand what the tithe was in ancient Israel, how it was to be embodied, and why it was that God required it of Israel, how might the tithe apply to Christians today? As I said at the onset, in my experience, few biblical teachings have been more poorly understood or more grossly exploited than God's requirement that Israel set aside a tithe. Part of the difficulty in applying the essence of these requirements to contemporary followers of God is threefold. First, we do not live in a primarily agricultural economic system. Most Christians do not own farmland or engage in animal husbandry. Funny enough, the majority of people in Western nations today would have fallen under the category of laborer in ancient Israel, of whom tithing was not required. Second, commerce today is mostly done with currency, so the wealth of households today is rarely in crops or animal production. The wealth of most Western households is bound up in currency, and most of what is produced in or by a household results in currency holdings or real estate or something like that. Third, Christians have not come into relationship with God by means of the covenant of Sinai. Instead, Christians have come into relationship with God by the new covenant of Jesus. So a principal question for Christians relates to how Jesus and his apostles understood the tithing requirements of Sinai to apply to new covenant faith communities. What is clear is that some of the principles which undergirded the tithe in ancient Israel did persist in the new covenant teachings of Jesus and of his apostles. For instance, Jesus taught the following in Matthew chapter 23, verses 23 through 24. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. In this passage, Jesus accused the scribes and Pharisees of carefully observing the first 2 years of the 3-year tithe cycle, but neglecting the 3rd, 7th, and 50th years. Jesus suggested that they should have followed all of the tithe requirements and not just the setting aside of crop yields and animal production for their own later use. This seems to suggest to me that Jesus still expected his people to live out the principles which undergirded the tithing requirements of ancient Israel. Furthermore, in a season in which the Christian communities of the Holy Land were suffering through a difficult famine, St. Paul the Apostle wrote the following to the Christians in Corinth, preserved for us in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 2 through 4. Paul wrote, "On the first day of every week, each of you is to put aside and save whatever extra you earn, so that collections need not be taken when I come. And when I arrive, I will send any whom you approve with letters to take your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable that I should go also, they will accompany me." Even more, St. Paul wrote the following to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 15. "We want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that has been granted to the churches of Macedonia. For during a severe ordeal of affliction, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For as I can testify, they voluntarily gave according to their means, and even beyond their means, begging us earnestly for the privilege of sharing in this ministry to the saints. And this, not merely as we expected, they gave themselves first to the Lord, and by the will of God to us, so that we might urge Titus that, as he had already made a beginning, so he should also complete this generous undertaking among you. Now as you excel in everything, in faith and speech and knowledge, in utmost eagerness and in our love for you, so we want you to excel also in this generous undertaking. I do not say this as a command, but I am testing the genuineness of your love against the earnestness of others. For you know the generous act of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich. And in this matter I am giving my advice. It is appropriate for you who began last year not only to do something, but even to desire to do something. Now finish doing it, so that your eagerness may be matched by completing it according to your means. For if the eagerness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what one does not have. I do not mean that there should be relief for others and pressure on you, but it is a question of a fair balance between your present abundance and their need, so that their abundance may be for your need, in order that there may be a fair balance. As it is written, the one who had much did not have too much, and the one who had little did not have too little. In both of these passages, St. Paul has emphasized the third year tithe along with the 50th year jubilee requirements of the covenant of Sinai. St. Paul has gleaned from the covenant of Sinai that God wishes those who have been blessed with material prosperity, that is, those who were landowners or livestock owners in ancient Israel, to set aside a portion of their income to care both for the poor and for those who are ministers of the gospel. Again, for Paul, the principle was not that the rich become poor and the poor become rich, but instead that those who are in need might be cared for by those who have excess, and even more, that the blessing might be returned if their situations in the future were to be reversed. In context, St. Paul's admonition appears to have been giving between congregations in different locations or cities, but the principle upon which he was drawing was from the tithe. What is lacking, both in Jesus and in St. Paul's admonitions of the early churches, is any suggestion that 10% of all income from every Christian household is to be paid into the local congregation and put under the jurisdiction of local church leaders or councils to determine how it is to be allocated and/or spent. In every place that monetary sharing is mentioned in the New Testament, it is discussed with respect to the meeting of a specific need at a specific time. Granted, one of those specific needs was in relation to the local church elder, as St. Paul reminds us in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 17 to 18 as follows. Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. For the scripture says, you shall not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain, and the laborer deserves to be paid. Of course, this would have required regular giving, if, that is, the double honor of which St. Paul spoke involved more than simply respect and also included monetary support. Even so, nowhere in the New Testament will one find an exhortation from Jesus or from one of his apostles that Christians should transform the First Testament tithe into a weekly monetary offering given to the leaders of local Christian communities to govern. Even more, nowhere in the New Testament will one find either Jesus or his apostles claiming that the local community of faith has become the storehouse from ancient Israel, or that God will bless those who give a set portion of their income to ordained church leaders to govern. How then might Christians apply the tithing requirements of ancient Israel today? Well, first, I do believe in submitting to authorities. And therefore, any time I have participated in a Christian community that requires tithing for membership or for leadership in a congregation, I have submitted. In my view, if they are wrong to ask this of me, which I suspect they are, God will judge them. I will submit, even if I know that God himself has not required it. If they have blasphemed God in this respect, that's between them and God, and I trust that God will honor my submission. Second, I do believe that the core lessons of tithing should remain parts of the Christian life today. Tithing teaches us that celebrating God's blessings at the end of every season is not a waste of resources, but a gift of thanksgiving to God. In my family, we eat the tithe every Christmas and Passover Easter season. Furthermore, tithing teaches us that part of celebrating God's blessings is sharing those blessings with those who have not been so blessed in any given season. As St. Paul has reminded us, sharing the tithe with those who have not produced in a given year should be part of our regular practice as Christians. Additionally, As Israel was called to share their resources with the Levites, who had sacrificed the normal means of sustaining themselves out of their call to serve the Israelites and the temple full time, we as Christians should also share our resources with those who have made similar sacrifices in service of Christ and his church. Of course, as St. Paul has opined, this is not to make the church or church leaders rich and ourselves poor, but only to support equity and fairness. Consequently, in my opinion, any church leader who is wealthier than those from whom he is receiving support is in sin and in deadly peril when God decides to act. May those who have ears to hear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Amen.